Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 248 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. And today we are going to dive into emotional intelligence with a focus, of course, on remote teams. And by we, I mean myself, Pilar Orti. Lovely to meet you if it's the first time you're joining us. And two guests, but two guests in the same recording, present at the same time. So that will make a change for you regular listeners who might be used to multi-guest episodes, but which are made up of different conversations stitched together. So I hope you'll enjoy this slightly different format. Now, I have my guests here now, sitting in different locations of the world. And actually, maybe in your intro guests, you can tell us that, even though we didn't prep for that. So let me start by introducing Rowena Hennigan, who regular listeners will have heard before on the show. But for those of you who haven't, well, Rowena is a remote work advocate and educator. So hello, Rowena.
Hi, Pilar. Lovely to be here again.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Where are you in the world, seeing as I talked about locations earlier on?
Oh, well, those who know me know I like to move around, but a little bit. So I really walk the talk in remote working. Today, I'm joining you from my co-working space, my provisional co-working space for the summer in Tarragona, La Caravana. And I'm based in Tarragona and La Pineda for the summer in Spain. But normally I'm based in Zaragoza. And I do, obviously, because of the accent, travel quite a bit and go to Ireland for work as well. So, but today from Tarragona. So hello to all.
Thank you for that. And joining us also is Sandra Thompson, who is new to the show. And she's a customer experience educator and consultant and the first Goldman Emotional Intelligence coach in the UK. Welcome, Sandra.
Hi, how are you?
I am well. Where are you?
So today I'm about 20 minutes west of London, but if we'd had this call yesterday, I would have been 2 hours north of London. So yeah, similar to Rowena, travel around, go where I fancy, wherever the vibe is. So living the dream of remote work.
Excellent. Great. Well, us three, listeners don't know this, but I'm actually in Spain at the moment because we had a holiday planned for a week, but then the quarantine rules in the UK set in. So we decided to stay longer in our flat in Spain and we'll probably still have to do the quarantine, but the ratio of time away versus quarantine will be a little bit nicer. So you are the first two guests with whom I'm recording in this setup. And of course, something that I think is also of interest to listeners is that the two of you have been putting together a series of videos talking about emotional intelligence. So you're used to conversing together, which is why I thought it would be nice to have you on as a double act. So talking of, before we dive into the topic of emotional intelligence and its importance in remote teams, and we might even get to how we can apply it to asynchronous communication. But before we get into all of that, I've realized I don't know your story as a dynamic duo. How did you two start working together? And we didn't prep who would answer this. Sandra, go for it.
So in a typical way, it's just like, no, you can. No, I can. So Rowena and I, we haven't actually met. We've not physically met. So that's quite an interesting first for me, working with people I've not met before. I posted something up on LinkedIn April time, explaining that I'd been doing some webinars for a variety of companies, all about emotional intelligence. And the request really was, anyone wants to work with me, anyone wants me to do anything to help them out, give me a shout. And up pops a little message from Rowena saying, this is perfect timing, we need to talk. So Rowena and I then had a conversation later that afternoon, and then it's continued from there. Hugely exciting.
I was saying to Sandra when we were reflecting on it actually the other day, that in that time of the emergency work from home, the really intense time, Pilar, of the pandemic and the severe lockdown, in Spain, I had to revisit all what I knew as a experienced remote worker, all that best practice, all the things I check in on every day, my self-awareness, how I'm feeling, self-reflection, all those things. And that began to get me thinking about those emotions, because as part of my work day to day, I'm trying to help people in terms of their learning and embracing remote work and virtual best practice. And part of that is seeing how you're doing, checking in with your feelings, having that space and time. And that's what Sandra and I connected on, really, because we could see so many parallels in terms of her work on emotional intelligence and her knowledge, and then how that's reflected in remote best practice. So since April, we've just been experimenting on different things. We've ran some pilots. We checked in every day using mainly asynchronous on chat. We have a Slack chat together channel, and it began to build from there quite organically as we began to draw the lines. We've both got a background as industry academics, which I think really reflects in our approach and the way we've worked together. So as we discuss things and notice these parallels, we look for research and information to back it up. Do you think that sums it up well, Sandra?
Ooh, why can't we hear you? Rowena, can you hear her?
Yes, I can hear her. She said perfecto.
Oh, wonderful. I can't hear her. Never mind. Okay. that is very strange. All right, let's carry on, and let's hope that I can still hear you. But if not, I will just assume that, because I can still see you, which is good, but I will assume that you will be saying great stuff. Sorry, listeners. Oh, I think I can hear you now. Right. This computer's doing all sorts of interesting stuff. So let's go into that. And there was so much that we, in true fashion, I would have loved to unpack everything Rowena was saying, because there was so much there about understanding how you work together and just when you start working with someone, how to approach that. But that will be that will be a different episode. So let's go back to then emotional intelligence. And I think it's worth going back to what do we mean by the term emotional intelligence. So Sandra, we will defer to you.
There are dozens, in fact, there's probably hundreds of definitions as to what emotional intelligence is, but the one that I use most often is the one by Dr. Daniel Goleman. So he's the chap who wrote the book in the late 90s, where he was comparing the ability people had with IQ, so intelligence quotient, and emotional intelligence. And what he was saying is that while you might have IQ, you really need EQ. You need emotional intelligence to be successful. And what it basically means is your ability to not only understand the emotions within yourself and to manage them, but also to be able to understand emotion in others in order to build really great relationships, in order to get your best work done, and really to have a happier life. So it's understanding and managing your own emotions, and it's around understanding and having an appreciation of emotions in others. Sounds really straightforward, but in fact, it takes time to understand what's going on in your own body, and it also takes time to really see what's happening in others.
Anything that you want to add, Rowena?
I think I'd only just add to that we're still always understanding it. There's such a spectrum of emotions, the granular detail within those. And as you grow as a person, where you are in time, as you self-develop, as you learn, you might experience them differently. You're going to experience them differently within the dynamics of a relationship as well. So that's all I would add, because as Sandra said, it can seem straightforward, but it's a constant process of learning and reflection. And that's been very apparent in these intense few months, certainly for me on a personal and professional level.
And I was thinking, as Sandra, as you were telling a little bit about the history of where your connection to the topic comes from, that in the 90s, we really started to talk about teams as well. Like as knowledge workers, the team thing became very big, and and now especially when we talk of remote teams, there is and all the connection that we want to have with those we work with. It seems to me like this is an amazing time, not just because of the context of the pandemic, but also because of the work in which we're structuring our work as knowledge workers mainly, that this is really important to come back to it. Sandra?
I think your points are hugely valid. I think the other really interesting thing about emotional intelligence, and certainly the thing that I love to read about, is the fact that knowing emotional intelligence is a skill, and knowing that you can develop it throughout your lifetime and you can become really great at it gives a lot of people an opportunity to grow. I think with IQ, I think you can alter it a fraction, but you're pretty much born within that parameter. And I think the ability to tune in is more essential than ever. You know, we're in an environment where it's actually quite easy for us to be more robotic. But the fact is, we have to be more human. We're designed to connect. We're designed socially to need other people and to grow relationships with them. So I think your point around the timing is absolutely right. And I do think it gives people hope that they can grow as individuals.
Yeah, and so that is very important, the fact that it's a skill, that it's something that it's not that our emotional intelligence is such and then we're stuck with it. Actually, we can, if we want to increase it, if we want to get better at it, if we want to connect in different ways, if we want to understand ourselves better, we can do it. It's a skill. It's something that we can practice, I imagine. So how do we see then? So this emotional intelligence, how can we see it? We can talk. Let's pick whatever we prefer. So, how do we see it in teams, in remote teams, or as individuals? Rowena, do you want to pick this one up? How is it visible?
Well, what I think is interesting for me is if we look at the premise in lots of the writings and research about remote work best practice, virtual work best practice for individuals and teams, we come across words like autonomy, self-management, self-awareness. Okay, so that's the starting point for me about that emotional unawareness, and starting with the awareness individually that we have these emotions, and actually reflecting on the last few months, because I see it as a catalyst, as you said, Pilar, that in the leadership space, there was a lot of talk about remote leaders and leaders in general being empathetic and vulnerable in that space when the pandemic, and I know some people, to honor their place, are still going through that now. But when it was really intense and people were suddenly sent to work from home, trying to start with empathy and understanding for where every individual was in that. And that's, as established remote workers, those of us in the community that are established and used to that, we maybe had a little bit of an advantage point. But I think that now has been propelled, and a lot of people are in the space where they're reflecting on those months. They've managed to survive. It may not have been pretty, but they've survived, and they're looking back. And that self-awareness of those emotions, moving to maybe being able to acknowledge and verbalize them with your teams in an open space. And when people have been thrown, what's been interesting for me watching is when people have been thrown into these terrible situations of working from a kitchen table, crazy hours or whatever, sometimes there has been extra levels of that vulnerability on video, that view from their wider team members, from their managers. And I think it's opened up, in some cases, a more vulnerable and honest discussion. And what I'm hoping, and this is where I work with Sandra together is hoping, is that we can maintain that conversation back into whatever these next steps are for us in hybrid working.
And also, it is interesting, I was reading yesterday, I think it was some work by Microsoft. They were reflecting, I think it was them, reflecting on some of the practices they'd seen that went back to the office. One of them, unfortunately, was working into the weekends. But I was thinking as you were talking that this experience of more vulnerability, more open discussions, in some cases more acceptance of how we are different because of our different personal circumstances even, is important then to take back to the workplace, because at some point, whether it's pandemic or not, whether it's a national disaster, our team will go through rough patches. So what is it that we can remember about how we're operating in these times? How the self-awareness we have, the conversations we have in the team, what is it that we can take forward so that even when times are not as difficult globally, actually we've got that as a resource. We've practiced that. But I think sometimes if we don't practice it and realize we've been practicing it, because a lot of teams will be doing this and haven't even had time to stop and reflect and realize what they're doing. So that's an interesting point. Sandra, anything to add?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've been speaking to people who are returning to work from being on furlough. So they've been kind of on a kind of set aside scheme, as it were. And the I think I can call it this. I think the joy people have felt when their managers and leaders have acknowledged how it might have been. So they've tried to empathize with those individuals who've tried to juggle family members, young children who need homeschooling, sick relatives, all that kind of stuff. It's really an opportunity for people to start having those conversations if they didn't have them before. And how remarkable would it be if your leader actually took more of an interest and their behavior reflected what you told them in that moment of vulnerability? Because ultimately the merge between work and life is more obvious than ever, and leaders and managers need to know, within peers, you need to know everything about what people are feeling, how they want to behave, how they want to be treated. So I think it's quite an opportunity right now.
What we've noticed in terms of our work together is that type of conversation is something that maybe people don't know how to do. That type of dialogue and discussion is something that team managers may not actually know how to even start to have that discussion and foster an open, safe space for that discussion to happen. It's maybe happened in one-to-ones ad hoc and by chance due to the nature of the crisis, but I think there is a spark of opportunity there to foster that, and using best practice that we're trying to do within some of our training that we've piloted, create those safe spaces for people to practice that, having those discussions, using those dialogues. And I do think there's an opportunity there.
The empathy bit is going to be so important. And you've mentioned the furloughing, Sandra. And I suddenly thought, well, a lot of the people who've been able to work remotely have stayed in their jobs. But of course, we might come back to the office to be with people who haven't. And I hadn't even thought of that version of hybrid, which is people who've been together and working for months, who are now, maybe because of the nature of their teams, are now coming together with people who haven't. So that's another layer of stuff. Right. So as well as empathy, which we can see is going to be needed, applied to, and also that self-awareness of where we're at in relation to our peers, I think. In addition to empathy, how else do we see that an individual or a team, actually, I'm quite interested in how do we see in a team has high emotional intelligence?
I was thinking, I think about that a lot. And I think back to a time when I had my dream job. And my dream job was working with a bunch of people who I could call my friends. They were people who had my back. They were people who naturally knew how I worked. And they also picked up on signals. I wouldn't need to say, I'm feeling a little bit under the pressure. I wouldn't need to say, oh my God, I'm so excited by this project. They would just know. They would pick up on the vibe I would give from the language, from the facial expressions, and we would enjoy working with one another. The other thing, which doesn't always happen, but when you see it, you know a team is fully in flow, is that truthful, honest, authentic feedback. And this is really challenging one another in a really healthy way, challenging one another to be the very best they can. And you don't see that often, but when you do, you know that you have a magical combination.
Really glad you brought in the challenging. This is, we're not talking about things being really as easy and smooth all the time, but actually part of being an emotionally intelligent team is knowing when to challenge and I suppose being comfortable challenging.
Yeah, that's the thing. And when we look at some of the established remote companies for reference points on this in the literature, we hear about very transparent policies, charters for team policy charters. We hear about retrospectives, if we talk about agile development, where these are regular within the rhythm of the team, where they reflect and they document and they can openly discuss. So I think that it's a balance between those things and creating that open space and holding that open space so people can challenge. Now, when we say challenge, I don't mean we've referred to asynchronous in text, that if it's a more difficult conversation or an important point, that you would default to video to do that, and that you would have key policies, processes, protocols for that written in. What if we reach this? What if we get to that, how will we deal with it if there's an issue? And again, practicing that, I mean, do we wait till we have it? Or if we are preparing and onboarding a team together, do we go through in terms of preparation for team operations? Do we go through, if we do need to review something or if we do need to challenge something, how would we best do that and work through it at the start of a team project or the start of onboarding? All this is practice within those operations, and we can see a lot of that in the literature from established remote teams.
So I've got 3 things I've picked up from that. So one is, and I don't want to forget them, and I don't have a pen and paper in my little booth. So one is, the fact that you both have one. Listeners, they just showed me their pens on video. They have their video, and they both show me lots of pens. Well, we're not there yet that you can pass them to me. So one is, actually, I am wondering whether distributed companies and people who are used to working remotely, whether through some of those practices of open conversations, of transparency, are developing that emotional intelligence, even if they didn't have it before. So we're going the other way. The other thing was about a remote worker, and especially a manager, knows that what tool to use when for communication. Maybe that's part of the emotional intelligence of someone. It's something we've been taking for granted, maybe. And the other one was, can I remember those protocols? An emotional intelligent team maybe then knows that at some point things will be difficult, and we've decided how we might go about it in advance, which comes back to your protocols and team agreements. So there's lots of stuff around there. I'd like to ask about the first one, which is, can we, and of course I've got a vested interest in this, because one of the things I do is I encourage people to take on certain practices of communicating in the open in their team. I mean, what do you think about this thing of, if we are operating in this way, where we're learning to constantly give feedback in the open, have conversations in the open, etc. Can that help to build a team's and individuals' emotional intelligence? I imagine it's context specific. But anyway, I'll throw the question to you, Sandra.
Yes, because ultimately this creates safety. Now, we know that psychological safety is a kind of subset of emotional intelligence. There are a number of academic papers on this that say, while it isn't always everyone's cup of tea, the fact is people being honest and authentic and doing it with the very best of intentions. And that's really key here. When we hear the word feedback, I can say from personal experience, it isn't always done with the best intention. But when you know people have emotional intelligence, when you know you have that connection with people and you like the other people, then you're more likely to trust that it's coming from the right place. So ultimately, we cannot have high performing teams without there being an element of safety, so that people can say what they're really feeling and what they're really thinking. It's critical to a group of people who really need to grow together and be resilient to all of the challenges that they're going to be facing. You know, it's big.
What are some of the things then that we need to be bearing in mind when we are giving this feedback in public, I suppose, because of the transparency, or when we are talking honestly? What do we need to be looking at? For example, I know I'm very careful that my written tone doesn't come too harsh in text and stuff, but what else, Rowena?
Well, I'm just thinking that Sandra said a word a couple of times that I really like and I want to pick up on.
Yes.
She said about friendship, okay, and building those connections first. So I think before we even give that feedback, right, what is our basis? What is our status of that relationship within the team? Is it strong? So I think we have to judge where we are first, because if that foundation isn't there, it may not be received so well, no matter what the tone. So I think that there is a process that needs to be followed in terms of, and ideally, I know it's not always possible, but ideally, where have you built that safety in? Is there a good foundation where people, they may not love each other, but they like each other and they respect each other? And then that the feedback is welcome, that there is a culture, and I don't use that word flippantly, of that we are all constantly learning. There is a place for this feedback within a process. And then, as you say, Pilar, right, looking at how you're going to deliver it in terms of writing and how it's going to be delivered. Maybe it would be more appropriate on a call rather than in text, etc., etc. And I think that's just something that you learn by experience as well. Sandra, would you add anything to that?
There's a really interesting point here around communication. And I know that we know this, but I just want to highlight it. What you broadcast isn't necessarily what someone receives. So the amazing thing about building connections and having friendships is that you can read what's coming back if you have face-to-face connectivity, if you have got a Zoom call or whatever. But even if you're writing something, you would always ask at the end, tell something like, these wouldn't be the words, but, tell me back what you think I mean by this, or my intention is this. How are you taking that? So feedback isn't a thing that you just drop and then you run away. Feedback is an ongoing process itself. So both of your points around safety are critical, but you're only going to build that safety if you check in with what you've said or how you've expressed what you've said. Because there's so many times when people have said to me, oh, I didn't get that from what you just said. Actually, I thought you said such and such. I'm like, oh no, not definitely not. And that builds trust.
Rowena, anything to add?
No, wonderful. Just that I'm learning all the time from Sandra. And even when we do some of the recordings, like we did one on active listening, and I hope and I try every day to remind, I'm still learning. I can always be better in how I listen, how I feed back, that we even check and balance each other in that we both have a responsibility in our relationship because we're human beings and our work relationship together, that so it's a two-part process. And she's really right reminding that it's not just of how you delivered the feedback, it's how it's been received, getting that feedback again on what's been heard, checking in, and it's an open discussion that's ongoing. Interestingly as well, we've even noticed sometimes in our dynamic relationship that sometimes we say, I'll come back to you tomorrow on that, Pilar. And I wanted to mention that as well, because that's almost something where we just want to digest something overnight. It's not an instant response, and neither of us take that personally, but it's something that we've built in our relationship over the few months, which I think is really interesting. There's no pressure to initially respond, that we will come back when we're ready in terms of a response. And that's something that I've noticed even in our dynamics. And that's why the way we work together is what we want to bring to our work together that we deliver out.
I think to reinforce the point made earlier, there are so many different methods of communication, tone of voice, language used, facial expressions. We're as a species, we're so fortunate to have such an array of tools that we can use. So there have been times between Rowena and I where we've mentioned something in text, we quickly jump on a call, or we quickly jump on a video conferencing just to work out what is meant by that thing, because very often we're working at speed. You can't afford to assume, well, that must be what Rowena said, so I'm just going to crack on. I just need to know is that the way we're going? And that's the amazing thing about our time, the technology we have and the range of things we can use. I mean, when I think about it, we've got WhatsApp going on, we've got Webby, we've got Zoom, we've got Slack, we've got it coming out of our ears. But over communication is one of the things I've learned from Rowena. It's, making sure that things are crystal clear. And that's helped me immensely with some other work that I'm doing. So, yeah, all learning from one another.
Yeah, and from some of the examples you were saying, we can start to move into this asynchronous communication, because one of the things, of course, you touched on is reply time, response time, and how that reply time is part of communication. It's become. So you know, one, that if someone is expecting a quick reply and you can't give it, I think part of that emotional intelligence is to have empathy for the person and say, okay, what are they going to think? So if you haven't agreed on that, then sometimes we just need to say. In what other ways can we see emotional intelligence, or the need to develop some in asynchronous communication? Let's mainly text-based, because I think that's what we've got more experience with. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I actually want to start with just the overall big picture on that, actually. And again, observing in the way Sandra and I have worked together in these recent months, because you said there about the expectation to respond, but in terms of your personal availability to remote work and your own work-life balance, you start with your availability in your calendar and the days you're working, your hours of availability. It sounds really fundamental, but for me, that's where I start every day. What is my availability today? Is there any change to normal? Do I need to let Sandra or any of my other collaborators know in relation to their expectations? And then future planning into next week. Simple things like having those checkpoint calls in, blocking out the days you're not available or the times you're not available, and then working down under the layers from that. So, of course, in terms of project work, we would be timeline driven or deadline driven. So, in terms of what we're moving in the project we're creating together, so we'd have that in, and then obviously we choose the different channels underneath that. But I think from a self-awareness and digital health and being, for me, I always start with what am I comfortable with in terms of working and my working hours this week. And I wanted to flag that because in these recent times, as you say, that expectation to response, Pilar, that expectation on yourself to deliver over that time. So, if you need to do that, if you start with that, it's the best place to start in terms of managing expectations.
I've got a couple of neuroscience things I want to chuck in, actually, because I find, this is really the core of emotional intelligence, isn't it? Basically, if there's a vacuum, if there's a period of time where we haven't heard anything, as human beings, we are likely to start thinking something isn't right, something is wrong, because in the absence of data, we just make it up. That's the thing we do. We bunch in a load of assumptions, and we'll think, well, she doesn't want to do that anymore, or maybe she's thinking about it, or maybe I've done it wrong. All this stuff kicks in. So there's that whole thing around the gap. And then there's the thing around expectations. So really building on what Rowena has said, again, the pair of us keep each other informed. If I'm going off to do something, or if Rowena's got a sideline doing something else, we'll just send a little note. And that's kind of what you expect in an office environment where you physically see someone who you don't by their desk. You're just doing it by communicating through Slack or another channel. And that just helps to keep you informed. It helps you understand what's kind of expected of you. But again, these are all emotions. These are all about feeling reassurance. They're feeling like you're contributing in the right way, feeling valued, feeling secure, and all of that wonderful stuff. If you don't keep one another informed, that's when the emotions start kicking in from previous experiences, from the way that you've been brought up. And that's why emotions are individual to each of us, because we have all had different upbringings, different beliefs, different values, and all that kind of thing. And that's why this whole thing of self-awareness, well, it sounds pretty easy, it is an ongoing process. And that's why we're so lucky, again, as humans, in that neuroplasticity. So the ability for us to adapt how we think and what we think about is up to us. And through the way that we keep each other informed, it means that I trust Rowena completely, that she'll be on it when she can. Same, I think, for me, and we get stuff done. It's quite remarkable. It happens, I think, more effectively in remote than it does when you're in the same office space together.
You were what you said at the beginning about making stuff up. I'm doing that all the time when I don't understand something and that someone has done, and I don't have the information to help me do that. And I think that's a very important point, especially for people who've had to make that transition without being ready, is that we are not used to communicating so much. And it might be, well, do I need to be reporting every step I take? Well, no. But, however, there's two parts to it. Someone needs to be communicating as much information just so that someone doesn't misinterpret their behavior. And then we go back to what you said right at the beginning about this positive intent, just thinking that actually people are doing things with the best intention possible. And if you have those two things in mind, that's, I think, a lot of the issues can be solved or avoided even. I want to recommend a book to listeners. It's actually, it doesn't have anything to do with the world of work, but I think as a psychology book, it's quite interesting. And it's called The Science of Storytelling. And I can't remember the name of the author, but I'll put it in the thing. And it talks about all this stuff, how we are the heroes of our own story. So, of course, everything we're doing has a great aim, but also how we will fill in the gaps. So just came to mind. Anything else we want to add to how emotional intelligence can help us have better asynchronous communication, or what things we need to bear in mind before we move on to how teams can develop their emotional intelligence together? Sandra, you opened your mouth first.
I'd like to add a really, it's one of those, this is so obvious, but actually doing it is one other thing. And it's the choice to respond. And what that means is between, and this is a work of a genius who wrote a number of books in the 40s. And he talks about the space between stimulus and response. You have a window where you can consider whether you want to react or if you want to respond. And what that really means is, I'm sure all of us, all your listeners will remember a time where we have reacted and we've regretted what we've done. We've regretted the language we've used, the tone of our voice, the message and everything, because we've come from a place where we haven't considered our own emotions and the emotions of others. So if we take a moment, even a minute, to breathe when we see a message or something happens, we can choose to respond in a way that would be of service to us and to others. And I think if that's one thing the people I coach learn, is that choice we have. You can choose to react and then you'll live with the consequences, or you could respond, and that way you build trust and you build better outcomes. It's been proven.
And that's why I love asynchronous communication, because I react very quickly. So I've learned actually with async, I can react, and that's okay because no one is around me to see how I've reacted. And then I can take my time and choose what it is that I want to come out. It's not about me, it's about the relationship with the other person. Rowena, do you have anything to add?
No, just because we had this interest, we did, and thanks for that reminder, Sandra. It's so true. But also, we had a conversation on LinkedIn a couple of months ago where we were looking at the different visual communications and visual cues from established remote teams, and some of the use of emojis and visuals. And we can refer to Lisette Sutherland's visual cue cards. We can refer to emoji development, which happens in specific remote teams in terms of response. So I also think that's an interesting thing to look at there. First of all, that there isn't the pressure to respond, but that they have their own little lingo in terms of approval. And we see it happening naturally on some Slack channels through certain thumbs up or different other crying faces or whatever expressions are being used. But I think there's a gambit of expression as well. And for some people and some teams, visual works really well as a way of embedding or expressing, but also reflecting their team culture if it's been customized in some way. So I also think that's worth mentioning there, which can be worked into asynchronous using those visuals in terms of response.
Yeah, you've reminded me actually a thread that we had around this on LinkedIn, which regular listeners might remember if they then went to look at it. But maybe we put the link to that. Before we go on to how teams can develop their EI together, emojis, we haven't talked about that. Is there any, has there been any research into whether they help, they don't help, whether it's got any link whatsoever to the emotional intelligence of a team, of individuals? What's the what anything?
Did you find something, Sandra? Because I don't know if when we were discussing that, we found anything concrete, did we?
No, so I'm sure there will be some out there. I haven't found any evidence around emojis, but what I do know is that there's something called emotional granularity. And it's actually some work that a neuroscientist did over in the States, a lady called Lisa Feldman Barrett, another great book, How Emotions Are Made. Cracking read. But she basically says that whatever techniques you can use to try and develop the language you need to express what you're feeling, smashing. And so I'm pretty sure that either there is research in tow right now, or we'll see some very soon that says how emojis start the conversation, how you show a symbol of something. And again, I think we have an idea on what emojis stand for, but again, watching out for people's interpretation as to what that thing stands for, but just starting a conversation. People actually don't mind talking about emotions. They just don't know how to. So if they have something like an emoji or a card that has a word on it that describes an emotion, it just gets the conversation going. And that's when you get to a much deeper creative conversation and a much stronger relationship.
Yeah, they're part of the shared language also, like you say, and especially as you work with people, you understand their use of emojis and stuff like that, whether they like using it, how they use it, when they use it, whether it's to reinforce a point or to counteract a point that might land badly. It's fascinating how they're used. I can't wait for audio to be integrated, because for things like ooh, that sometimes I want to express that I don't know how to express in words. Now I'm using an emoji. There's a really good emoji that does ooh, but I would love to be able to press a button and the other person, when they're reading it, they get this sound at the same time. Anyway, enough of that. Let's start to wrap up with teams who want to do this together, because we can do this individually. We can have our own plan. Everyone can go at their speed, but there must be. Well, I'm going to defer to you. Is the value then in teams looking at this and trying to develop some sort of team emotional intelligence, Rowena?
Yeah, I wanted to just comment, because I don't think we've specifically called out the fabulous word culture that everyone wants to attain in the remote work organization and the remote work team. And if we reflect on what we've just spoken about in the last half an hour or so, all of this is the foundation, the fabric of culture. It's that je ne sais quoi that it sometimes can't, there isn't an exact recipe or formula, right? But fostering that open space, safety, trust, open conversation, accepting that there isn't a need for a response, all these things we've covered are all the elements that go into building culture in terms of a team and an organization. I think it's an important shout out, because it's something that a lot of remote organizations and teams are striving for. And I believe that, and this is why I've partnered with Sandra, it is fundamental in building culture, the skills of recognizing, appreciating, awareness on emotional intelligence, and how they feed into our individual actions, thoughts, feelings every day, and then how that reflects in our work with others and builds teams and organizations.
I'm even wondering whether it's if we do want to build this quite strongly, whether we need to name it. also sometimes, and this is just a thought, if we want to have a culture of emotional intelligence, then we need to start working towards it, especially if we've said it's a skill and something that actually we can adopt. And even that conversation at the beginning of, okay, for all these reasons, we want to become an emotionally intelligent team. What do we do so that this becomes, what norms do we stick to if we want this culture to be one of emotional intelligence? Rowena?
Or even better, what feelings, what language, what language? Because I mean, Sandra does it by the way she is in her training and how she operates as a coach and as a person and as a mentor. You can hear the language is so open, welcoming. It makes you feel safe. That takes practice, but as managers and listening individuals, you can start to use that language in your interactions, both with yourself and with others. But I think that's a really interesting point, Pilar, about do you think there is a hesitancy in your work in terms of using that term emotional intelligence or using the term talking about feelings? What do you think?
No, I don't think there's a hesitancy. I think it's difficult to know what it means. So, and I don't think teams usually ask themselves, are we an emotionally intelligent team? But I think that, for example, psychological safety is talked a lot about. People are talking of that and they understand that. And I think that it's because the thing with emotional intelligence is what you want are the behaviors. And I think that's why we talk about psychological safety, because it gives us a set of behaviors. Oh, we can look at what can we do. So I think, what I do see, and it's very interesting, is that emotions sometimes and using how we feel to have better relationships at work sometimes is confused with we have to be personal and tell things about our personal life. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, that emotions and knowing that they're there, knowing how we work with them is different to telling each other stories. I mean, I can be completely safe with you and I am terrible. I mean, my emotional intelligence sometimes seems like it's terrible, but maybe it's a choice I make sometimes. I've arrived in teams and been horrible. Because I was being myself and because I was very upset. And the only way I had of showing that upsetness, it was by being upset. But they don't know a clue about my personal life, but they know me very well. So I think that even that distinction, and it might be a geographical cultural thing, I don't know. That's another huge conversation, whether some cultures see this more of a blur or whatever. I don't know. So yeah, I think there's a difference between emotions and personal life, and those people who haven't really had to address this before sometimes see it as mixing.
Mm-hmm.
I think very often emotional intelligence is seen to just be empathy. And I think when I talk about the 12 competencies that sit underneath the emotional intelligence skill, people suddenly start to think quite differently. Yeah. And I think as well, the word emotion, people often go to negative emotion and they think of it being a scary thing. And how am I going to deal with that? Because of, it's an array of everything we feel. It's joy, it's laughter, it's anticipation, it's restlessness in the positive sense. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And I think the need for us as human beings to be a different person who goes to work than the one that's at home is no longer accepted. The young people that I teach, they do not see any reason why they should be, in inverted commas, professional at work. And then when they leave work, they then can be themselves. It's ridiculous. So I think that accepting that emotions flow within us, positive, negative, they might not even have a label of positive or negative. They just are. But being able to say to someone, when you did that thing, I felt a bit like this, either positive or negative, people can choose what to do with it. But that's when you see the growth in people, when they hold that space and they decide to change their behavior as a consequence of you telling them how they're feeling.
Even the word emotional, I've never heard someone say, oh, they're getting so emotional, meaning they're getting really happy.
That's why we're back to the topic of language and even being conscious of how we express ourselves. And we did mention writing and neuroscience, but that where, and you even said an asynchronous, Pilar, and I agree with you, you can have the reaction to yourself if you see something, but then you can go away, digest it, maybe write a few notes down to process it, check in with how it's making you feel, what are the emotions, and then respond in time when you're ready. And I think that that's where there can be negative connotation. Someone's very emotional about that. But like, I know for me, my emotions give me the passion to teach, that my emotions give me my drive, why I care that, everyone experiences remote work as best as they can. However that's within my control, etc., etc. So you have to see that they're also the things that keep you in balance. They're not negative or positive. They're just all the mix of how you are as a person. And I think it's also interesting that Sandra referenced, it's all been merged in these recent times. And my exposure to young people in teaching as well through the university, I would totally agree. They don't see, a lot of us who have come through maybe a more traditional corporate career, even if it's been remote, see there's maybe two personas, one for work, one for home life or for life. And I do think there's massive changes in that coming. And that's where having these types of conversations and looking at our language and even saying how can we improve and how we use that language, these are all things that remote leaders, remote workers as individuals can do.
Excellent. So I'm going to wrap up. So I'm going to ask each of you individually to, one, of course, if listeners want to connect with you, where should we send them? I'm also going to maybe ask, Sandra, you mentioned something very important, that emotional intelligence is composed of different components, of different things. And some people who are not familiar with the term might want to look further into this. So it'll be nice maybe to recommend, if you want to recommend a book or maybe your own website or somewhere for them to go, that'll be great. But otherwise, if you want to say anything else apart from where people can find you, this is your opportunity. I'm going to give the microphone to each of you. Sandra, do you want to start?
There are dozens and dozens of Harvard Business Review articles written by Daniel Goleman. And there's one particular one, actually, I'll probably send you the link to it, which will show you exactly what I'm talking about when you see the grid. But I think if people want to understand emotional intelligence and psychological safety in the context of remote work, they should check out our website. And I'm going to leave Rowena to, because I can never remember the address. How embarrassing is that? But I'm going to leave Rowena to mention that. But honestly, reach out to us through LinkedIn and check us out on our website. But this is the area we're super keen for people to understand from a relationship perspective and also from a mental health perspective. People who are practiced in emotional intelligence are happier and they're healthier. And that's what we want. That's what we want for everyone.
So Sandra Thompson, and the surname is Thompson. Thank you, Zoom, for it's great that it's got the names very easy. So you can connect with her on LinkedIn. And Rowena, any last words, and also where shall we go and find out more?
So you can find out about our joint work and our joint program of training under the new brand, RISE, RISE, Emotional Intelligence. And we've got a website that we've launched as well. So this, what started as some conversations in April, in July, moved to a joint collaborative project together. So we're launching that with you today. And the website is RISE, RISEINNEI, and we'll share that in the notes, RISE Emotional Intelligence. And you can also get to that through my website, rowenahennigan.com as well, and you can connect with us on LinkedIn.
This is super exciting. So we're recording today mid-August, but this will hopefully, if nothing changes, go out mid-September. So the URL of the website, Rowena, is RISE Emotional Intelligence?
Yeah, I'm going to put it into chat. It's RISENEI. So it's a .com. And as I said, if you connect with either of us on LinkedIn, there's a page as well, RISE Emotional Intelligence on LinkedIn already set up.
Wonderful. So listeners, if we are post-COVID and you're driving, be careful. But if you have a pen and paper, RISE, RISEINEI.com. So yeah, it's the equivalent of RISE in and then EI. Wonderful. We'll stick the link in the show notes. That's what they are there for. So big thank you. Thank you very much, Rowena Hennigan and Sandra Thompson, for your time and energy. And to you listeners, the same, for your time, your energy, your focus. It's always a privilege to know that you are there. And we've heard our guests' contacts. And if you want to get in touch with me, remember you can do so over at pilar@virtualnotdistant.com or the contact form on virtualnotdistant.com, where you can also sign up for the monthly newsletter. And you can hop over to our LinkedIn page, the Virtual Not Distant LinkedIn page, and comment on stuff there. I'm on Twitter too. I'm Pilar Orti, and I'd love to connect there with you. I love that social network. Listeners, I hope you're doing okay, and thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.